Welcome back to Generals and Napoleon, episode 102, General Belliard, Chief of Staff to Marshal Murat. Before we begin, I'd like to remind all of our listeners that if they'd like to support this podcast, consider becoming a Patreon member by going to patreon.com/Generals and Napoleon. We have free memberships and paid memberships where you'll find ad-free bonus content. As always, we appreciate your support. Now, on with the show. We have a very honored, esteemed guest back on the line. We have the great Jonathan North with us. Hello, Jonathan.
Hi there. Hi, John. Nice to see you again. How are you doing?
Good to see you. I'm good. Yeah, Jonathan's a historian and author of several Napoleonic and other history books that you can find on Amazon. And we're going to talk about a guy today. When I think of chiefs of staff, I usually think of Marshal Berthier. But this guy, he was a chief of staff for a lot of people, wasn't he?
He was. He's a very talented general. He's a little bit unknown, which is unfair, I think, because he really went through the entire Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars, keeping his nose clean. And he's a very talented, very educated, articulate man. Interesting career. And I hope we'll take a look at that career a bit today.
Yeah, the guy we're talking about is Augustin Daniel Belliard. And what's kind of your overall sketch of this man? He was basically at every major engagement, wasn't he?
That's right. His career does follow almost the classic trajectory of the revolution and imperial army. He's sort of in the shadow of Napoleon, rises up through the revolution, and his career is mingled in with Napoleon and some of the key marshals. And he always seems to be there, a little bit in the background, but he always seems to be there. So it's a very interesting career. It's a little bit not as well known as it should be. He left some memoirs, but they're quite difficult to read. They're a bit fragmentary. They're not one of the great classics. But he also left quite a lot of material that hasn't been published, that are in the archives. So he's a really interesting figure to get into.
Yeah, and in terms of bad news that was delivered to Napoleon over his life, I would say Belliard had to give him one of the worst pieces of bad news in history was that, Paris has fallen.
Yeah, that's a really difficult one. But I would think that he did it quite professionally. And I think that's the mark of the man. Relaying bad news to military officers is a talent, and it's part of the job. So, that was a difficult one. I think we'll come to that in 1814, but that was probably one of the low points.
Yeah. Napoleon had that great line. It was, if I'm sleeping and there's bad news, please wake me immediately because, bad news doesn't age well. But if it's good news, allow me to sleep.
Yeah. I think we all could agree with that, definitely.
All right, well, let's dive in here. Belliard was born May 1769, same year as Napoleon in Wellington, by the way, in the Vendée region of France. What do we know about his upbringing?
Yeah, I think that's already quite an interesting story because La Vendée it's notorious in the revolutionary period for being royalist. One of the regions of France that rises up against the revolution. Goaded by priests and royalists and aristocrats, it fights the revolution. But Belliard really gives the lie to that. So he's born in the La Vendée region to a prosecutor at a local court. And he spends first 20 years of his life in that region, gets educated there. We don't know an awful lot about that time, but when the revolution breaks out, 1789 to sort of 1791, he's one of the first in that region to volunteer into a local unit called the Volunteers of La Vendée. So it's not the case that everybody in that region was hostile to the revolution. You can see in his reaction and the reaction of a number of his peers that actually they greeted the revolution with enthusiasm. So he joins this local unit, and that's when his military career begins. Of course, France is still at peace in 1791, but he very soon gets involved in the war that's declared against the revolution.
Yeah, in 1789, as the French Revolution begins, Belliard organizes a group of young citizens, which will eventually become part of the National Guard. And he later becomes an officer, a captain in 1791. Do we know his first experiences in the military, how that went?
Yeah, so he's, like you say, he's one of the first volunteers in the region, becomes elected captain because in those units, many of the positions were open to election. It was all very revolutionary. A lot of the old aristocratic officers would soon be leaving and going into exile. So it was a great opportunity to rise up through the ranks. But what he does, he actually joins the staff of a general called Dumouriez, and he's at Valmy and Jemappes. So he's in that first army that goes off to face the Allies as the Allies invade France and the nation is in danger. So that's his first experience of war.
Well, that's pretty cool. Valmy was like one of the biggest victories of all time for France, so that must have been a good one to start off with.
Absolutely, very positive.
He's promoted again, and he fights again at Neerwinden, but is suspended for a few months. But then he's back in the ranks by 1794. Is this? I see a lot of this happen during this time.
Yeah. Yeah.
Officers are questioned, or even Napoleon was in prison for a bit for like various accusations. Do we know what happened with Belliard here?
Yeah, so like you say, he was a major at this time when he went to Neerwinden. So the French were taking the war across the frontier into Belgium, which was then the Austrian Low Countries. So they were fighting a campaign. They're sort of beaten the Allies and taken the war over the frontier. But Dumouriez, the man who Belliard was serving on the staff of, he actually defected to the Allies and went over and joined the Allies. So that brought all of his staff under a cloud. This was the time Robespierre was taking charge. The so-called terror was in full swing. So a lot of officers were under suspicion for either having aristocratic roots or being in cahoots with the Allies. But obviously, if you're serving a general who defects, that places you in a very difficult position. So what he did was, he was suspended as an officer, but he volunteered as a private soldier, which, much to his credit, I think. He served as a chasseur, and he does that for a year until his name is cleared after the fall of Robespierre in 1795. So I think he comes out quite honorably, but obviously it's a very difficult time for officers.
Yeah, but like you said, that kind of shows his humility. Like, look, I'll serve as a private soldier if you want. I know I didn't do anything wrong,
Yeah,
but
I think it's a measure of his character. I think that you can see this in his career, that he's got a very, very forceful and professional character.
yeah. And by 1796, Belliard is stationed in the soon-to-be French army of Italy, where he's chief of staff to future Marshal Serrurier. What qualities? Obviously, Marshal Berthier is the most famous one, but what makes a good chief of staff during this era?
Yeah, so like you said, Belliard joins the army of Italy. He's again on the staff and becomes chief of staff to this rather elderly general. But yeah, the qualities of a staff officer. So the French staff had been very effective before the revolution. It had gone through a difficult stage and it was coming back together, coalescing back together and getting professionalized again. But I think we underestimate the amount of work involved in being a good chief of staff. So the ability not to sleep and not to eat, very high up there. But basically, you're involved with an awful lot of correspondence with with officers under your own general, with neighbouring units as an army moves forward or backwards. You're in liaison all the time with central government or local authorities. You're keeping registers of correspondence. You're keeping registers of numbers present, numbers in hospital, numbers wounded, things like that.
Yeah.
And really, whenever a commander asks you, where's the 21st line, you're supposed to know where they are, what they're doing. It's really hard work.
Yeah.
And to be an effective one, you not only need to be tireless, but I think you also need to be able to have good people alongside you and around you. So Berthier is very good, but he also has selected a very good series of aide-de-camp, captains on the staff and people that can work well with him together. It's a really good example of teamwork. That sounds a bit ridiculous, but it was actually very important.
Yeah, and you got to keep an eye on logistics, like food for the horses to eat, food for the men, ammunition, guns, cannons. How are we getting there? Maps. It must have been like you said, like constant, where you don't sleep at all. You're just constantly working.
Absolutely, and even in peacetime, you're getting soldiers in getting into trouble with locals and a little bit of fighting and squabbling. Then there's the food and the organizing leave, organizing promotions, and it's a lot of work.
Well, Belliard fights again at Castellon, Caldero, Arcole, the last of which he's promoted on the battlefield to general of brigade by Napoleon himself. So I guess he's really making a name for himself at this time.
He is. So I think one of the things I noticed about Belliard that he's not just a staff officer. He's not just there writing orders and dictating letters. He's there at the front. So he's wounded at Caldero. And at Arcole, he actually helps save Napoleon from a counterattack of Hungarian grenadiers. He places himself right between them. And that's really why he gets promoted. So he's a good staff officer, but he's also very brave under fire. And I think in that sense, he's a good example of an all-round general.
Yeah, because usually you're good at one or the other. Maybe you're a Marshal Ney and you're good at leading troops from the front, but you're not good at administration. Or maybe you're really good at administration like Marmont, but maybe you're not the best on independent command. Like it's hard to be good at both things.
It is. It's very hard, and I think that it's good to see him when the pressure's on and the chips are down. He really comes out as a very capable um, fighting soldier.
Well, he joins Napoleon's expedition in 1798 to Egypt, where he commands a brigade under General Desai, and he fights at the battles of Alexandria and the Pyramids, which are victories. What was his experience like? It seems in Egypt he had some real highs and lows.
I mean, I think everybody did. It was a very strange campaign. Belliard was in Italy at the time the expedition was being put together. He was in Rome, and then up down to Naples. And then he got the call that a secret expedition was being prepared and that he had to come to the port of Civitavecchia. And it was there that he joined Desaix, who gave him command of the 21st Light. It's a very small brigade, just one regiment. But he then set sail with the expedition. Some of it left from France, so the main expedition left from France under Napoleon. But also you had these soldiers coming out under Desaix from Italy. And they all joined together at Malta. They took Malta, then they sail on and land in Egypt near Alexandria, come down the Nile, baking in the July. I mean, what an idea, landing in Egypt in July. But, that's it's a valid criticism, but it didn't stop them.
Nope.
And they make it to just before Cairo when they come across this huge, almost medieval army of mounted warriors, the Mameluke army, which has come out from Cairo. And the battle is a rather strange one. So the French form squares, the Mamelukes launch a charge, and it's Belliard's men that are on one of the first to receive this huge charge. And they just beat it off with musketry and artillery, and the Mamelukes flee. So it's a really meeting of modern warfare as opposed to warfare as it had been, 300-400 years ago. But nevertheless, it's a difficult campaign. They enter Cairo. The Mamelukes flee. Napoleon seizes the capital, and Belliard is then given the job with Desaix of going south and pursuing what remains of the Mamelukes into the desert. And he basically ends up quite close to Sudan, all the way down in the south. And they're pursuing this renegade Mameluke called Murad Bey. for a long time. And really, when you imagine the scale of the distances involved and the fact it was mostly desert, it's a very interesting campaign.
Yeah, indeed. And eventually, though, Napoleon, he loses most of his navy at the Battle of the Nile. He's forced back from Acre after trying to go up that route towards Constantinople. So he has to flee. Well, he chooses to flee back to France. What do the fortunes of the French army and Belliard? What are they after Napoleon's left for
Yeah.
France?
Belliard and Desaix are down in the south. They waged this campaign. They're using infantry to catch cavalry in a territory the size of France. So it's not an easy campaign, and all the time you get these jihadists coming over from Mecca to fight the French, to fight the Christians. But eventually they do defeat Murad Bey and impose a kind of peace in the south. And Belliard comes up to join the rest of the army. Napoleon's gone back to France. A commander called Kléber is taken over. Kléber gets assassinated, and then the Turks and the British send armies to fight the French. And basically, you have a very small French army now, isolated, no more reinforcements, no more recruits, sort of shriveling in the heat. And Belliard is assigned to become the governor of Cairo. He's there with about a garrison of 900 men, trying to keep order on this huge seething capital.
Right.
And the British and Turks show up, and he's forced to surrender to the British and Turks, and he gets repatriated back to France with his troops, gets an honourable surrender, good terms, and he gets sent back to Europe.
Yeah.
So that's quite a good ending in a way.
I was going to say, for a no-win situation, like you said, 900 troops against, the whole city of Cairo plus the British plus the Turks.
It could have been a lot worse. Let's say that. Yeah.
Well, as you mentioned, he's repatriated to France, and he becomes chief of staff to the flamboyant Marshal Murat in 1805. Obviously, you and I know a lot about Murat. What a guy to be assigned to.
Yeah, flamboyant is the word. And I think this is where the relationship with Murat begins properly. And it's going to be quite a long one. So we'll see later on that he stays quite close to Murat for much of his subsequent career. So obviously they get on very well. Mm-hmm. You've got the flamboyant Murat charging around in fancy dress, and you've got the capable Belliard doing the paperwork.
Right, which is probably what Murat needed, was someone to do all that.
He did.
The little stuff. Yeah. But there's a great story, and I want to get to it here. Belliard fights at Austerlitz, and famously, around that time, he assists Marshal Murat and Lannes in their ruse to capture the main bridge into Vienna. Can you tell us that story?
Yeah, sure. That's the famous ruse of I think it's called the Tabor Bridge, and that's in November 1805. So it's the only bridge left intact over the Danube. The French need it to get to Vienna, and it's guarded by some Austrians who've mined it, and they can set the mines off and it'll blow the bridge up. So the French really need to get this bridge intact so they can cross the river. It's quite a big river, the Danube, at that point. And so what they do, they send General Bertrand across the bridge, and he starts talking to the Austrian general a little bit further back, while Lannes and Belliard decide that they'll go for a stroll. They walk onto the bridge, chatting just casually. They get talking to the Austrian officers. And things look like a nice stroll in the afternoon. Meanwhile, the French troops move a little bit closer. The Austrians get a bit suspicious.
So is it Lannes and Murat doing this? And they're like,
Murat's around, but it's really Lannes and Belliard who are doing who are taking the risk and going onto the bridge and talking. And the Austrian officer finally realizes what's happening. He starts shouting. Belliard Lannes starts shouting. Nobody can hear what's happening. Bertrand comes back with the Austrian general. Lanes and Belliard declare there's a ceasefire, there's a truce, hooray, hooray. The French troops move on to the bridge, they defuse the mines, and then the French say, oh, sorry, we've captured the bridge. So it's a classic ruse, but it's incredibly risky. And I think it does go down in the sort of history of war as being one of the greats.
Yeah.
And of course that contributes to the success of the campaign and makes them look really good.
Yeah, I was gonna say it takes a lot of guts to stroll across a bridge that has mines and explosives on it in your full dress uniform, and yeah, talk the Austrians off the bridge.
Yeah, and I'm afraid it doesn't make the Austrians look particularly good.
No,
but
yeah,
worse would follow.
yeah, yeah. Well, in 1806, 1807, Belliard fights at most of the major battles, including Jena, Lübeck, Eylau, and Friedland. And it just seems like this guy is everywhere on every major front. So he must be, like you said, just a useful general, a fighting general, but also good at logistics. He's just a good guy to have around, I guess.
I think so. And you can see almost that sort of classic Napoleonic career, Austerlitz, Jena, Eylau, Friedland, under the nose of the emperor, visible there, doing good work, supporting. He really should, I think, be earmarked for promotion. But it's not always the case that those who deserve promotion get promoted, and that's true of life.
But he has a lot of the traits of marshals in that he was in the army of Italy. He was in Egypt. He was at some of the major. You wonder if he was ever close to getting that baton.
I know. I would have nominated him, but we can't do that. So,
well, his career's gonna get a little tough right now. In 1808, he travels to Spain as Marshal Murat's chief of staff again, and he retains that position for Marshal Jourdan after Murat leaves to be king of Naples. And basically, Belliard's governor of Madrid from 1808 to 1810. Extremely difficult after the uprising of Dos de Mayo.
Yeah, I think it's a very, very difficult situation. Like you say, he's with Murat. Murat is sort of the imperial lieutenant right at the heart of Spain when the whole country goes up in arms. And so you're surrounded by a sea of insurgents, and there you are trapped in the capital, which is, again, hostile, a bit like with Cairo in 1800, 1801. And he proved himself at Cairo, and I think he proves himself again at Madrid. He's very capable. Murat leaves, as I say, goes off to Naples, and he becomes he becomes governor of Madrid and also on the staff of Marshal Jourdan, an advisor to Joseph Bonaparte, who becomes king of Spain. And Belliard is governor of Madrid when the British under Wellesley fight the battle at Talavera, coming quite close to Madrid. And then you get various Spanish armies also trying to retake the capital. So there's a lot there. It's someone you want a cool head, steady hand, cool hand, why not? In charge, someone who won't do anything too rash, a capable person, and that's what Belliard proves to be.
Yeah, he does, and he's just a good guy to have around, it seems. In 1812, though, for the invasion of Russia, he's again assigned chief of staff to King Murat, and he's wounded at Borodino, but survives the retreat out of Russia, which is remarkable in its own right. What kind of becomes of Belliard during this time?
Yeah, so he's called back from Spain to Germany in late 1811. I think it's a special request of Marshal Murat to have him serve as chief of staff on the reserve cavalry, and they go into Russia in June 1812, and it's very much a cavalry campaign, huge distances, armies sweeping here and there. It's a lot of work. Then you've got the epic battle at Borodino, which is again major cavalry action. Murat's again heavily involved in that. And the day after Borodino, in the pursuit, that's where Belliard gets his leg bruised by a round shot. Very painful wound, basically knocks him out of action. And he has to retreat through Russia in a carriage. Enormously complex and difficult time. But he doesn't sort of sit around recovering. He's back at imperial headquarters in 1813. And we have an interesting episode where he's one of the people, along with Murat, who say to Napoleon in August 1813, look, the Allies are offering you good terms. We could have a peace treaty. You could keep much of Germany, and all this can come to an end, which is quite a brave thing to be doing at that point, because obviously Napoleon, single-minded, determined to continue, thinking that he could win that decisive battle. But actually, the decisive battle turns out to be Leipzig in October 1813, and that's where Belliard is wounded again. So he has an arm broken at Leipzig. Yeah, so like for many French general officers, it's a very difficult time.
Yeah, because you've done some epic things. Obviously, all the marshals and most of the generals are rich by this time, so maybe they just want to enjoy some downtime with their families. But Napoleon, being Napoleon, says, no, we have to keep going. So, yeah, that must have been difficult.
And also, you've got to recognize as a professional soldier when the odds are against you. So, at that point, October 1813, you can see that the weight of Allied forces is just so immense.
Well, in 1814, Belliard fights in several battles in the defense of France. And later, this is what we teased at the beginning, after the Allies capture Paris, it's Belliard who brings the bad news to Napoleon. Do we know, was this on the road, or where was Napoleon coming from? How did they meet up?
Belliard, with his broken arm, he takes charge of a cavalry division during the 1814 campaign, and he's very active. Fights a number of the big 1814 battles, but he's in Paris at the end of March 1814, where the city basically decides to throw in the towel. Napoleon at that time is over Fontainebleau, and it's Belliard who gets the difficult task of going from Paris to tell Napoleon that the city will no longer hold out. And Belliard meets Napoleon on the road between Fontainebleau and Paris, and it's Belliard and Caulaincourt, who's very close to Napoleon throughout that whole period, who persuade Napoleon to go back to Fontainebleau. Napoleon's all for marching on Paris and throwing out the Allies, but the generals say, you really shouldn't be taking the fighting into Paris, and the situation's changed. And just at that point, it's Marmont who then flips and changes side, and basically Napoleon's forced to abdicate. So Belliard's role is, again, I think, quite an honourable one. The advice he gives to Napoleon is good, but the events overtake them all, and so Napoleon is forced into an abdication where he really wanted to carry on the fight, whether that was sensible or not.
Yeah, you wonder, like, if Napoleon had disregarded Belliard and Caulaincourt and took it into Paris, it would have been probably very bad urban fighting, and a lot of the city would have gotten destroyed. So it's, hindsight 2020. You wonder what would have happened. It was probably the right decision.
Yeah.
So Napoleon obviously abdicates, and Belliard initially serves the returning Bourbons under King Louis XVIII. But when Napoleon returns, Belliard flocks to his banner, and Napoleon gives Belliard command of the forces in the Moselle. But again, obviously, the emperor loses at Waterloo, is forced to abdicate a second time. What happens to Belliard when the Bourbons return?
Yes, so like you say, Napoleon abdicates, and as with many of Napoleon's generals, Belliard gets employment under the newly returned king, under the Bourbons. And again, he gets a staff position under someone called the Duke of Berry, and he does his paperwork thing again. But then when news comes that Napoleon's escaped from Elba and is making his way up to Paris, Belliard escorts Louis XVIII to the frontier with Belgium, and then says his goodbyes and returns to Paris. what happens is a bit strange, but Napoleon appoints him as ambassador to Marshal Murat, to Murat, King of Naples, his old friend. And Belliard sets off to Naples in April, May 1815. Now, Napoleon was hoping, I think, that Marshal Murat would coordinate with Napoleon and together they could liberate Italy. But Marshal Murat, being Marshal Murat, has already acted and stormed off into northern Italy to fight the Austrians, gets totally beaten, and comes charging back to Naples. And it's at that point that Belliard arrives in Naples. He sees Murat completely distraught. Murat himself will disappear off to France in a day or two, and Belliard comes back to France, never having been ambassador for more than a couple of days. He gets appointed to the Moselle, but it's in June, early June 1815, and a couple of days later, obviously after Waterloo, the whole imperial project collapses again, and Belliard finds himself in a lot of trouble for having taken up employment with Napoleon. So he actually gets thrown into prison for 7 months.
And it could have been worse. It could have been Marshal Ney or some of the others that were killed.
Yeah, there was a list of generals and officers that was being circulated who were to be taken and either brought before court martial like Ney was, or sent into exile. Belliard was, I think, partly because of his good character. He wasn't actually tried like that, but he was in prison or kept in confinement for 7 months, so that his case could be processed.
Well, he's released in 1816 and basically lives a quiet life until his death in 1832. What do you think his legacy is? Because I always see him in any biography of Napoleon, you see Belliard pop up all throughout the story. What do you think his legacy is?
Yeah, Belliard is popping up. He's there at all the major events. There's one last little twist in his career. So, like you say, 1816 he comes out of prison, but towards the end of his life, when the Bourbons are overthrown in 1830, Belliard gets appointed as ambassador to Belgium, which has just recently declared its independence from the Netherlands, and he goes as ambassador there. And he's very instrumental in getting French support for the newly established Belgian territories. And he manages actually to persuade a French army to come and help the Belgians. So there's a big statue of General Belliard in Brussels, sort of rather chubby, bit plump, but looking quite relatively martial and stern. So for the Belgians, he's a bit of a national hero.
Right.
For the French, I think, a little bit forgotten. But like I say, he was there at all the key events. A professional soldier, kept his nose clean out of politics, always someone good for good advice, and a brave and talented man. He's just one of those individuals that's raised up by the revolution and has an astonishing career from Cairo to Moscow. And is just someone you can enormously respect. There aren't that many like that.
Yeah, but it seems to me like Napoleon's Grand Army was built on guys like this, whether it was him or General Foy or Clausel. Some of these Gerard, two Gerards actually, these generals didn't quite make Marshal, but they did a lot of things that were kind of off the radar.
Yeah, I think they're the sort of the bones and the brains of the Grande Armée. You get sort of Murat waving the swords and charging around, but you get Belliard doing some of the heavy lifting and thinking.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, making the rock stars look good, basically. Yeah.
Exactly. Good management.
Well, thank you for that, Jonathan. That was lovely. Again, Jonathan has a number of books, including one on the death of Marshal Murat that I recommend you check out on Amazon. And as always, we thank him for his time.
Thank you very much. It was a real pleasure.